Hot stove is an old baseball term, but we can certainly apply it these days to college football. So much news going on concerning every team across college football. We talk Ohio State with Pat Murphy from Bucknuts 247 Sports. Pat, how you doing today?
I'm good. It seems like the off season just never really exists. There's always something going on when it comes to major college football. As you know, Mark, it's what keeps us employed, though. So I guess that's a good thing.
It is a good thing. We've got to have things to talk about, and the news keeps coming fast and furious because we're in the age of the transfer portal, and the NFL draft is always an off-season uh, portion of what we have to address. But before we get to those, of course, Brian Hartline has been one of the hot commodities in the coaching ranks across college football for quite some time now, both from the standpoint of just recruiting out of his mind and then also developing those guys into NFL stars. And we just completed an NFL season in which Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave posted the best numbers of any wide receivers in their first year in the NFL this season. But Brian Hartline now has new responsibilities at Ohio State. So Ryan Day had told us that he was going to step to the side, and now he has gone ahead and done that.
Well, I'm still not entirely sure what the situation will be when you're referring to the play calling there. I think that's something that was not mentioned, and intentionally so, in the press release that came out announcing Brian Hartline's promotion to offensive coordinator. That I think is something that they are still working through at Ohio State. And I do believe that the report, I think it originated from Kirk Herbstreit, but it's come from other places as well. That Ryan Day, excuse me, is considering or planning on giving up play calling duties or being less involved with that. He's still going to be very much a part of what they do offensively, obviously, but the promotion of Brian Hartline certainly indicates that the direction Ohio State would go is with Brian Hartline as the play caller. Brian Hartline has never called plays. This is his first time as being an offensive coordinator. I think some people were a little bit surprised in this move because you have Justin Fry on the staff, who was an offensive coordinator under Chip Kelly when he was out at UCLA before coming to Ohio State. And I think a lot of people assumed that would be the guy who steps in for Kevin Wilson in that role. But you have a hot commodity, as you mentioned, like Hartline, who has proven to be very good with these wide receivers. And neither you nor I are in the meeting rooms, but I imagine Ryan Day has good reason for believing, even if he doesn't hire, or even if he doesn't give Brian Hartline the full play calling role, that he trusts him because of what he's seen over the last several years to be able to run this offense similarly to what Kevin Wilson did. I think it's always going to be Ryan Day's offense, and that's how they're going to operate things. But Kevin Wilson obviously had a big part in it. So did Brian Hartline. So did Justin Fry. So did anyone who's ever been involved with it. So, look, I think the big news is that they've kept Brian Hartline in Columbus at Ohio State. He is certainly someone that other programs have been interested in. His recruiting, as you mentioned, has been off the charts. He has, we were talking before the show, Mark, he has the top 6 all time since they've been, doing player rankings. He's recruited the top 6 wide receivers to ever come to Ohio State, which is pretty impressive. And he's also shown he can develop guys. You look at a guy like Chris Olave, who, while he may have been a bit underranked because of missing a year of high school football, still was not the finished product that he was as a senior his freshman year. So Brian Hartline has shown he can kind of do the gambit with the wide receivers, and now he's going to have a chance to take that to the whole offense and see what he can do there. I think this could be really helpful for Ohio State when it comes to recruiting. He will still be very involved with wide receiver recruiting, but I think that role will expand out to other positions as well. And not that Ohio State is hurt for offensive talent, but I think you could argue maybe the offensive line recruiting hasn't been what they've needed it to be. Justin Fry is obviously just finishing his first year here, so he will certainly help that. But Brian Hartline can kind of get his hands in on everything on that side of the ball, and also show what he can do as the offensive coordinator and what very well could be a play calling role.
So the other component is in this, and the way the game's played is uh, promoting for the sake of promoting, meaning that this person has shown the aptitude and the ability to perform in that role, and then the need is also there. But then there's also that component that you've alluded to, that you retain valuable people that way. You give them a new challenge, a new role, something, especially when you would consider Brian Hartline, most likely, I would think, one day wants to run his own football program and be his own guy and be a head coach, and you give him a step in that direction.
Absolutely. I think if you look at just the career trajectory of Brian Hartline, it was, unless he just was super content with being the wide receivers coach at Ohio State because that's the program he played for and the position in which he played, the next logical step was an offensive coordinator role somewhere. And look, Ohio State's done this with a lot of guys promoting from within, even staying within the family when they brought Kerry Combs back. I think there's been some mixed results. You've had Corey Dennis, who probably doesn't get enough credit for the quarterback recruiting and development at Ohio State, because obviously Ryan Day is still heavily involved. Corey Dennis has been a great promotion to quarterbacks coach. You just saw Keenan Bailey promoted to tight ends coach. I know everyone within that program really believes in him. You've seen some other ones that haven't done as well. So I think there's certainly confidence that Brian Hartline can take this on. The guy played at Ohio State. He's been in NFL offensive team rooms. He's worked with a variety of different coaches, and he's just a bright offensive mind. He's, as I said before, he's very much a part of what this group has done over these last several years since he's been in the program. And I don't think Ryan Day is just going to promote Brian Hartline just to keep him around if he doesn't think he can do the job at the level expected. This is Ohio State, and the offense has been one of the best in the country for years now. This isn't like Brian Hartline is taking over an offense at a school that's trying to build something up. So the standard will remain very high, and there certainly is belief that Brian Hartline can meet that standard just as well as others have done in the past.
We got Pat Murphy here from Bucknuts 247 Sports to break down Ohio State football as we are fully entrenched in the offseason now. Two consecutive first-round NFL quarterbacks in the late, Dwayne Haskins and Justin Fields. C.J. Stroud most undoubtedly will be the next in line. While NIL has taken over this sport and has become a huge component in the recruiting of players, both on the high school level and then also the possible recruitment of players as they enter the transfer portal, we now have what's being talked about as a possible other facet of this, and that's keeping guys around for an extra year. And I don't know that this is anything that anybody should lay money on, but there is talk out there about CJ Stroud possibly hanging around for another year if the NIL money matches or comes within some kind of range that he determines worthwhile.
Yeah, this is a tough one to speculate on because, look, the CJ Stroud hasn't made a decision. We're recording this on Friday, January 13th, and I believe they have until the 16th, draft eligible players to make their decision. Almost every other Ohio State player who there was much question about has made an announcement, and CJ Stroud seemed like a guy that would be one of the first to make the announcement, right? And so obviously that leads to speculation. Ohio State also put out a tweet tagging all of the guys that are coming back with, I believe it said, like, there seems to be a trend here or something, and people jumped all over that. I don't know for sure what CJ Stroud is doing. I don't know if he is just waiting for the graphic to be made to announce that he's going pro, if he really is giving consideration to coming back. I think that it would be mind-blowing to think of a guy that is a two-time Heisman Trophy finalist and has accomplished what he has accomplished individually and is expected to be a top five-ish pick coming back. But you mentioned there is the NIL component, which CJ Stroud has already benefited from in being the Ohio State quarterback. And I imagine there are those out there that have the means that are Ohio State fans that could offer up the money to get him comfortable enough to play another year of college football. I think if he really is considering coming back, I imagine that the legacy play, something we've talked about a lot, would be part of it. Remember, CJ has not beaten Michigan, and he would be the first quarterback. Well, he is the first quarterback since Steve Belisari to lose back-to-back games to the Ohio State's rivals. But if he were to come back another year, he would get an opportunity to kind of erase that a little bit next year in Ann Arbor. He's not played in a Big Ten championship game. That would be another thing that he could come back. And obviously the loss to Georgia, where Ohio State was so close, and you saw the best of CJ Stroud, maybe he sees a path to, if I come back, we can take it a step further and get to the national championship game. Obviously, there is a risk if you're CJ Stroud and you come back. The NFL draft stock probably isn't going to change too much. Now, if he plays every game next season, assuming he does come back in this scenario, like he played against Georgia, maybe he is unquestionably the number one pick next year. There obviously will be a number of other guys in that draft class, Caleb Williams from USC, guys like that they could be a part of it. So that's something to consider. But he if he does decide to come back, and CJ has always kind of done things a little bit differently than your average college football player, it would set a new trend for a guy, a quarterback specifically, that is this highly regarded and is almost assuredly a top 5 pick to return to college football. And I would be very interested to hear after the fact, if this is in fact the case, what his thought process was, which I'm sure if he does come back, we'll get to talk to him about. And if he doesn't, I would also like to hear what took so long on this, because it does seem, it is odd. Usually these guys that are such locks to be high draft picks announced in a couple of days of the season ending. I think Alabama had guys announcing the day after they played their bowl game. So yeah, I think there will be a lot to ask CJ the next time he talks, whether that's over at the Woody Hayes Athletic Center as a returning fourth-year Buckeye, or at the draft combine when he speaks to media ahead of his workouts there. It's certainly going to be interesting either way.
I am not an NFL scout. I'm a guy that watches college football. I'm also a guy that likes watching the NFL. But in determining the ability of these players to make a decision and their viability at the next level, again, I only listen to what is out there from credible sources. But when I see Tommy Eichenberg and when I see Ronnie Hickman, and I know they play different positions, of course, but considering how well Tommy Eichenberg played this year, and Ronnie Hickman had a fine season, but Eichenberg just was a dominant player for much of the season. I guess I was a bit surprised to hear Eichenberg's coming back, Hickman's leaving for the NFL draft.
To me, in that one, I think those are decisions that were probably made ahead of time. I mean, Ronnie Hickman announced, I think, the week of the Michigan game that this was going to be his last season. So he'd obviously been thinking of that for a while. It was really good 2 years ago. Was the leading tackler for the Buckeyes, which says more about the defense than it probably does about Hickman's play, and that's no slight on him. This past year, I thought he was good, not great. I didn't think he was as good as 2 years ago. I think he probably hurt himself a little bit in terms of the draft, but if he's ready to go, he's ready to go. With Eichenberg, I think it's more of a case of he really only has one good season on film. Last year was getting his feet wet longer than I think people expected, and it really wasn't until the Rose Bowl, really the second half of the Rose Bowl, where you started to see the Tommy Eichenberg that we saw this season. So I think in his mind, he can help his draft stock by coming back and putting back-to-back really productive years. It'll be the second year under Jim Knowles, who is also his linebackers coach. I think he sees an opportunity there, at least, to help himself. And like with CJ Stroud, look, these guys aren't necessarily hurting anymore for money if they so choose to sign NIL deals. They can make this decision more comfortably than they could in the past. I think previously you saw a lot of guys that needed to get to the league, to get money, maybe make the decision to declare earlier than they should have. And they also obviously have the NFL evaluations that come back on their play. They've done that differently now, where it's basically go to the draft or come back is kind of what they're told. So instead of being round by round, which is what it used to project. So, we don't get necessarily the information on them, but I would imagine Tommy Eichenberg probably didn't hear exactly what he wanted to. Whereas Ronnie Hickman, like I said, I think his mind was made up pretty far in advance that this was going to be his last year in college football.
Pat, we sliced and diced, you and I, the excruciatingly difficult loss to Georgia. And now here we are after a national championship game, and it's even difficult to spit it out in that form to say that was a national championship game based on the level of the two teams on the field on Monday night. But that just adds a whole other dimension to the missed opportunity by Ohio State. And we can't use the transitive property to say, here was the Ohio State-Georgia game. This is how good the Buckeyes are against the best team in the country, and therefore they would have annihilated TCU. However, I think it's pretty reasonable to make that conclusion to say this team is that good. They would have played an opponent that they certainly were superior than in a national championship game, and they missed that opportunity because, my goodness, that was just about the biggest blowout we've ever seen on the American sports scene for a championship game.
Yeah, I was roasted on Twitter, and rightfully so, because I think it was the end of the first quarter, I tweeted something along the lines of, I know people probably haven't watched a ton of TCU this year, but this is what they do, and I imagine they will make adjustments at halftime, and this game isn't over. And I was pretty wrong on that front. The game was over by the end of the first quarter. From an Ohio State perspective, yeah, I think you look at this exactly as you said it, Mark, the missed opportunity. Maybe Ohio State doesn't defeat TCU in the same manner as Georgia did, but we saw those two teams go toe to toe. And, I think you look at the weapons, Brock Bowers obviously had a big game for Georgia. There were a couple other receivers who did some things, but I think if you look at what Ohio State had weapons wise, we are under the assumption that Marvin Harrison Jr. would have been healthy. Maybe Cade Stover probably misses out on the game, but still the weapons that CJ Stroud had and the way he played in that game, I think if you put him in a national championship game with those guys around him, that offense is going to do some damage. And look, I think TCU, and that's probably the biggest difference in the Georgia game, I think TCU probably is able to score a bit more on Ohio State's defense. But I think it looks like some of the games we saw from Ohio State throughout the year, some of those Big Ten games where the opponent was able maybe to hang around a little bit, but Ohio State just ended up having too much firepower. Easy to say now in speculation, but I absolutely think that the Buckeye fans, Buckeye coaches, Buckeye players, I can't imagine being a Buckeye player that played in that game, especially maybe a Noah Ruggles or guys that were a key part of it, watching that national championship game and trying to process how close you were and what that could have been. I don't know if there's been a scenario like that where you can say as definitively from a close game to a not close game that was the national championship game in the semifinals. So yeah, I think excruciating is probably the right word for anyone involved Buckeye Nation wise in what happened there. And that's one that Ohio State's going to have to live with for a while because, obviously you've got all off season. You're going to hear about how great Georgia is, and you're going to have to know that you were 1 point, a 50-yard field goal away from maybe being the team in that conversation all of a sudden.
If Ohio State scores 3 less touchdowns than Georgia and TCU scores like 3 more touchdowns, it's still like a 3-touchdown game. So
Right.
it's inconceivable that Ohio State would have lost that game. And the only game that comes to mind playing out a scenario that you just laid out was exactly 10 years ago. Georgia, Alabama played an SEC championship game down to the final play of the game. And then Alabama went and annihilated Notre Dame in the BCS championship game. And it was conventional thought that Georgia would have done the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's probably the closest thing I can think of. But Yeah, I watched the game with some Buckeye fans. They did not enjoy it at all. I watched the game with some Buckeye fans. They did not enjoy it at all.
Pat Murphy, Bucknuts 247 Sports. Pat, we always appreciate you stopping by and giving us the insight.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Mark.